AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey. And by Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world.
Hey, Gary.
John, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
I'm doing real well, thank you.
Yeah.
So I know we're going to have we're going to talk about Ford Motor a lot on the show today.
Yeah, they had their Capital Markets Day on Monday.
And I discovered a fun fact about Ford Motor Company on May 25th, 1927. Henry Ford announced the Model T was done.
Going away.
The next day, he and Edsel drove out of the Highland Park plant in the last Model T, and that was that.
That's right. Because then they switched over to the Rouge plant and started making Model A's.
Right.
Not right after that. I think they were out of production for like a year or something like that, weren't they?
No, they had a few came out in December of that year.
Okay.
So they got some, but I mean, just imagine how times have changed to the extent that, you know, someone could announce, "Oh, we're done," and the next day they're done. Okay, yeah. It isn't like they're going to be done in 3 months, or we're going to run this year out as the way it is now. I mean, it's just like, we're done. Goodbye.
Yeah. Well, Henry ran that with an iron fist, and what he said went. That's how it happened.
Yeah, and but I thought that was rather interesting since we're on May 25th. So, and speaking of Ford, we should bring in our friend Keith Naughton.
Hi guys.
Keith, great to see you. And we've got Michael Robinet from S&P Global Mobility as well. Michael, great to have you on the show.
Good afternoon. Hope you can hear me okay.
Loud and clear. Loud and clear. And Keith, too. I know we got a lot to get into today, especially focused on suppliers. And I think that will be a nice segue later into the show as to what Ford talked about and so much of what it talked about at the Capital Markets Day.
So Michael, you did a report for S&P Global Mobility about suppliers and the transition to EVs. And in that, you suggest that there are some suppliers that think that EV may be a fad, and consequently they're not taking measures in order to address that. So, I mean, what are the nature of these people? Are they living in a cave?
That's a great point, Gary. No matter of us in the forecast industry to, chirp in the ear and say, listen, it's not a matter of if, but when. But this is the world they know, and they understand the ICE world. They have relationships in the ICE world, and there's some suppliers, and again, I would say it's a small subset, pretty small subset, but nonetheless, there are some that basically say, I just don't believe it's going to happen. There's not enough lithium. The infrastructure's not ready. Pricing's too high, and every new technology, every new shift in global manufacturing, basically it never started out easy, and I think we're at that point right now, and this whole transition is going to be pretty lumpy. I think we all would agree that there's going to be the word smooth and EV transition is not going to be synonymous. But to your point, Gary, I would say that there are suppliers out there that just don't believe that it's going to happen and want to be there sort of to be able to catch the industry when it comes back to them. And I'm not sure there's going to be much to catch.
So, Michael, let me guess here. These are probably smaller suppliers, tier 2 and 3, and they're probably on the ICE side of the business, i.e. ICE powertrain. Is that right?
You've hit the persona pretty well dead on. These are family-run companies. They're on their second or third generation. They've done very well at what they've done. They usually have an advantage in the market, and which means that they probably have decent margins. And they start to see those margins eroding because we've got programs that are elongating. In other words, I might have been on, let's say, a 5 or 6 year engine program, and then the OEM taps you on the shoulder and said, "Yeah, I don't really need to redo that engine anytime soon. So, your throttle body or your valve that you're supplying, just keep supplying it for a couple more years." And you're thinking, "Oh, I would rather have replaced it with something that made a little bit more money, but okay, I will." And that's exactly what's happening over and over and over in our industry right now.
Boy, this seems like they're not thinking ahead here. I mean, even if EVs catch on slow, they're going to replace ICE vehicles. The entire market's not going to increase just because EVs are coming into the market. EVs are going to take sales away from ICE products. Or do they not see this, or they just have their head in the sand?
I think there's a little bit of head in the sand. They also are looking at case studies. I'm going to call it case studies, but situations over the last year or two or three where we'll see that BEV came into the market and it was a really slow launch and it hasn't done as well as everybody thought. But we got to remember the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a calamity of one thing after another impact the supply base and the industry from a supply perspective. So, it really hasn't been the best example of what has been going on in the industry. So, but to your point, it's a matter of these will start to come in, and burying your head in the sand may only work if you're strong in the aftermarket, and maybe that's what they're looking for.
Keith.
So, one of the things that Jim Farley and Doug Field, the Chief Technology Officer at Ford, has stressed is, particularly this week at Capital Markets Day, is that this isn't just about an electric propulsion system. They see the bigger revolution coming in software. So it's not just the mom and pop ICE, tier 2, tier 3 players. It's the tier 1 players who make those black boxes that control all sorts of functions in the cars that the customers interact with. Ford wants to bring all that in-house. Doug Field wants to control all of that. In fact, I was in Doug Field's breakout session on Monday, the second breakout session, and if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read to you a response he gave to a question. Somebody said to him, you're talking about a massive amount of content of software from your suppliers. How do they feel about that? And he says, suppliers that have content that's woven into customer functions, it's not going to be possible to keep running the business that way. The supply base doesn't like that. It's not a big surprise because they could be relegated into contract board stuffing, board manufacturing if they don't add value through software. So I would say there's still a place for partners who can have modular pieces of software and can do it really, really well, but they have to be great at it, and they've got to be willing to live with our APIs and build on our platform. And if they don't, they can't be part of the future.
Keith, that's amazing, what you're talking about there. I was in that session as well, because, what Michael has brought up is largely tier 2 and tier 3, smaller suppliers that are into ICE powertrains. What you're talking about there impacts the multi-billion-dollar multinational, the big tier 1s that have poured massive amounts of resources into software.
Right. So, the way, and Michael knows this so much better than I do, so please, Michael, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong here. But the way those companies traditionally have improved margins, improved volumes, added value, was by creating content that customers did touch and control and feel. That was a differentiator. If you could have a better touch screen, a better IP, whatever, you would win the day. Now Doug Field is saying, no, we're going to control that. And, that is going to be something we're bringing in-house. That's a huge change for the supply base. And there's going to be a lot of losers in that scenario.
I would agree. There's a lot of suppliers that as part of their business plan had assumed, hey, I'm going to make hardware, but I'm also going to make much better software. I can do it better than the OEM. Right. Now, I will say that there's a lot of suppliers that can do that. That there's a lot of suppliers that are very, very good at what they do, and the OEM doesn't have a capability in their space. But what Doug said is basically synonymous around every OEM. They want to control anything that the customer touches or feels. They want to control that.
Mm-hmm. And that's a change.
But Michael, I mean, getting back to the study that you did in, more of the mechanical aspect of these things, is I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact of, how much software Doug Fields wants. It doesn't matter because it has to go into a vehicle that people are able to drive and steer and brake and so on. And, one of the things that I think is interesting is that, okay, you point out that there are 1.3 billion ICEs out there right now, and that you don't see, the change to full EVs for some years to come.
Absolutely.
And so I guess what I'm wondering about here is what happens to these suppliers? Do they just cease to exist, or are there alternatives for them to do something else?
Well, the more proactive ones, and listen, and John brought it up earlier. There's a lot of mega tier ones that saw this coming years ago. The Contis, the Bosches, the Magnas, they all saw this coming and basically said to themselves, we have to get ready for it. So they went off and they invested in the BEV space, whether it be in e-motors or other factor, or basically condensers and other electronic content that's required for the BEV. But to your point, the smaller companies are definitely, you got to classify suppliers in kind of two spaces. In the ICE space, there's your pure OE supplier where, there's maybe one per vehicle. And once the vehicle is built, you usually don't have much of an aftermarket for it. I'm thinking things like intake manifolds and throttle bodies and cylinder heads. You don't hear often, hey, I'm going in to get a new cylinder head job. It just doesn't happen these days. So that's kind of one per vehicle. But then there's a lot of suppliers that have an aftermarket tail to them. The belts, the hoses, and braking and other parts of the vehicle that are a little bit more where there's usage and there has to be replaced. They're going to have a longer tail, and that's where the 1.3 comes in. But what we tell a lot of suppliers is, listen, once your OE market is done, it's done. There's not a lot of aftermarket after it for a couple of these players.
You mentioned about these major tier ones that saw the EV revolution coming and got on board with it, Michael. But I mean, they came out with electric motors, fully integrated systems, gear reduction units, the power electronics, eAxles. I mean, do they realistically have a chance of selling those to the major OEMs when, like Keith points out, Doug Field says, no, we want to bring all that stuff in-house?
Major OEMs, I think that's going to be a problem. They look at that as basic content of the vehicle. They want to control more of the value out of the vehicle. So your GMs, your Fords, your Daimlers, they have all basically built out e-motor capability. They're obviously joined together with battery suppliers. They're making battery packs. Some of them are making their own battery enclosures. Some have outsourced it. So I would say the smaller OEMs, to gain some level of scale and capability, they may look to those suppliers. But that's been a real kind of head knocker for a lot of suppliers. They thought, let's get ahead of this. I'm gonna introduce e-motor capability and e-drive capability. But the OEMs came along and said, yeah, I'm okay. I'm going to make my own. And plus my union partners want me to employ as many people as what I had before. So I'm going to do this in-house. Plus I think I can do it better and with scale. And so, it's been a strategic issue within the supply industry.
And it's going to force a lot of change. People are going to have to rethink their business models entirely.
They're already doing that right now. I mean, you've seen several OEMs kind of split their businesses. You've seen many tier ones split their businesses. There's a lot of new joint ventures out there, and suppliers that have more or less said, well, I'm going to wait for this to kind of form and then I'll make my choices. The problem is that the early BEV platforms, and by the way, there aren't a lot of them, just to let you know, the early BEV platforms have already been engineered, they've already been sourced, and either they're being built right now or going to be built over the next year or two. So that train has left the station. So if you're sitting at the station, well, oh, another train coming down the tracks. No, there isn't. It's way around the bend, and you may not be there long enough for when it arrives at the station.
Michael, are there any new engine programs? Are there, how does that look going forward?
It's very limited. I think GM was out there saying that they've got one coming, and there are some what I'll call vocation-based engines. In other words, engines coming out for a reason because they have to be redesigned for emissions or some other reason. But for the most part, the OEMs are all done designing engines, maybe repackaging them, but they're all done designing engines.
It's so funny because I have a story coming out in Business Week this week about all the redesigns of the mid-size pickup trucks, which are almost all ICE. The only even partially electrified one will be the hybrid that Toyota's coming with. So those are not new engines. Michael's right, but they are still selling and getting margin on those ICE vehicles.
They are, but there is not a lot of new technology. The technology is coming in maybe in hybridization of them, maybe in a mild hybrid or a PHEV or a full hybrid type of structure, or maybe for emissions compliance, maybe there's some additional things that they're doing. But frankly, there's just if you want to look at it on a scale of 100%, I'd be floored if more than 10% of resources are being spent on ICE engines these days.
But it is interesting. I mean, the OEMs are investing in ICE. GM announced a month or two ago it was putting $900 million into its V8 engines. I was recently at a manufacturing equipment company that has equipment that is used on ICE manufacturing lines, piston engine lines. And what was interesting was they were not building new equipment. They were refurbishing old equipment from General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, and others too, Cummins, and the ag equipment, the off-highway equipment. So they want to keep their ICE lines viable, efficient, modernized, but they're using as much old equipment as they can. And I asked the guy who ran the facility, so do they save money doing it this way? And he goes, yeah, they save some. He says, but think about it. They've got to disassemble this stuff, put it on trucks, ship it to us. We've got to unpack it all. We got to go through everything, evaluate what can be used or what's got to be replaced. Then we got to put it all together, get it up and running, get it to an SPC level that they find acceptable, disassemble the whole thing, ship it off to them where they got to rebuild it and do the same thing all over again. And I said, so why do they do it then? He says, because then they don't have to write it off. And as you guys probably know, write-offs, that's an expense. It comes right out of your bottom line. So they're trying to keep their ICE production lines as viable as possible and looking for every nickel and penny that they can save to do it.
Well, they still need to make the money off the ICE vehicles. Right. That's what's financing the EV strategy. That's why there's going to be a Mustang dark horse. We're still seeing lots of talk about horsepower out of Detroit.
John, you brought up a really interesting point, though. Right now, capacity utilization is at a certain level, but as we require fewer ICE engines, and even coming in the 24, 25, 26 timeframe, we're going to start to scrub off a couple percent every year. And as we start to scrub that off, everybody thinks, well, once I get down to 50 or 60% utilization, maybe I'll wave the white flag. Smarter suppliers, they see that coming. They're not going to wait till 60%. They're going to say, hey, I'm already between 85 and 80%, and I don't see an avenue where I'm going to get better. So to your point, they got to stay as efficient as possible and be able to whittle down their operations as much as they can to stay as efficient as possible as they reduce their capacity going forward. It's going to be a fine art building ICE components over the next decade.
Michael, and listen to what you're saying, because once you get below your break-even point, holy crap, Kyle, you're just losing money at that point. And I don't know where their break-even point, let's just say for argument's sake, it's 50%. But when you get to below that break-even point, you got to go back to the automaker and say, either you raise your prices dramatically or I stop shipping tomorrow.
Guess what's happening right now? We know a lot of people on the OEM procurement side and the great volume of their day, and also on the supply side as well, is basically going back and restructuring prices and trying to convince your customer, I've got a real problem here. And sometimes it's the squeakiest wheel that gets the grease, which is unfortunate. So I would say, and I know the supplier relationship survey came out earlier this week, but I would say that that is probably the biggest bone of contention right now in the industry, bar none.
But going back to what Keith was talking about in terms of the everybody's launching their new midsize and they're putting internal combustion engines in them, so there's still life for those things. And then I was looking at some numbers today that just came out of Europe, and so we look at Europe like, oh boy, they're really ahead of us in terms of electric vehicles. So right now, electric vehicle take in Europe is 14%. Okay, 14. The take for diesel engines is 15%. Gasoline, 37%. Mild hybrids, 16%. Hybrids, 9%. Plug-in hybrids, 9%. So with the exception of that 14% that's electric vehicles, all the rest have gasoline or diesel engines. I mean, there's still a whole lot of those things being built.
Yeah, but Gary, the one thing I think we have to all remember is that we have, and I've been quoted as saying this in the past, we've bevved on the edges so far. We've done, large Hummers, and we've done small Bolts, and but we haven't bevved for Ma and Pa Smith in Des Moines that own an Equinox or an Edge or something like that. That's basically where the meat of the market and where the volume is, and that's going to be the telltale sign for the industry: is can you sell battery electric vehicles to the masses in the middle of the market? That's where the volume is. And the Europeans feel that, well, in fact, they're legislating that it's going to go that way. We are as well a little bit later, but that's going to be a real telltale sign going forward.
And Michael, don't you think that's an unanswered question at this point? Because currently our mainstream vehicle is the Model 3, which is not, well, it's getting closer to mainstream prices, I guess, with all the price cuts from Elon, but it's not exactly mainstream priced at over $50,000. So we haven't had the Equinox test yet, have we?
No, not really. I mean, I think, GM's coming out with a couple of vehicles. Stellantis is, Ford is as well. I would say 24, 25, 26, we'll be able to come back on this show and say, well, let's see how it occurred over the last 3 years. And that's going to be the real telltale sign.
Right.
Michael,
the question is, has all of the volume so far just been those early adopters, the first mover crowd who want the latest technology? Or is there some regular folks who are buying it because they think it's a better mousetrap?
I would say that there's probably some regular folks, especially markets like California, that basically feel, hey, this fits my lifestyle better. But there really haven't been a lot of vehicles for them to choose from, like you were saying. I mean, in that sort of $35,000 to $55,000 or $60,000 range, there's not a lot of product out there. That's where a lot of the newer product is starting to come in. And then, so how the OEMs, how they bring that into the market will be really interesting.
For sure.
Michael, I love you. You created a new verb for us that we haven't bevved for this or we haven't bevved for that. I love it.
I got another.
What?
I got another one. Webster's, I'm sure, is going to call me, but the word call ops. Where the supplier gets a call on Thursday and says, I'm your customer and I don't need your stuff on Monday, so I'm calling you off, and you don't need to send anything on Monday. That's a word that a lot of suppliers don't want to hear.
Hey, going back to what Gary pointed out on the diesel engines, is there a lesson in there as to how this is going to go? Because if diesels, what'd you say, Gary, 15%?
Correct. Yes.
So, I mean, they used to be 50%, 50% in Europe. And now 15, are there lessons to be learned from the collapse of diesels in Europe?
I think there is. And a good friend of mine in the diesel industry told me a couple of years ago, he said the diesel folks are very nervous about all this, let's call it petrol or gasoline volume going down, mainly because the gasoline guys cover a lot of burden for the diesel folks. And so if you've got declining gasoline volumes and diesel's also declining, maybe not at the same rate, they were covering a lot of burden for them, back office burden and other factors. And now diesel's got to carry more of its own load going forward. That is a big concern for the diesel industry. To a point, I know that Forvia decided to sell off their exhaust manufacturing application down in Columbus, Indiana. Why? Probably because they want to make sure that there's still more technology coming and they can keep the diesel engine running.
But John, one of the things I think that we got to think about in terms of diesel in Europe and the 50% down to 15%. I mean, the immediate thought is, oh, Volkswagen. That's what did it. But if you think back, it used to be tax policy made it far more appealing for people to buy passenger cars that had diesel engines than passenger cars that had gasoline engines. And so, I mean, it was a tremendous difference, which caused the big rise in diesel. So it comes down to a legislative play. And, the thing I sort of wonder about is that, so you may have seen today, 27 Senate Republicans sent a letter to the Biden administration saying, hey, you got to slow down on this emissions thing. And earlier this month, 151 House Republican members basically did the same thing. So what I wonder about is, okay, if the legislation changes, what happens then? And so Michael, does that make the people who think that maybe EVs are not going to be, all this in a piece of cake, like, oh, this is great. We have this opportunity because there will be a new administration. Rules will change.
Funny you say that. I got that very question this morning from a client at a presentation. And the one thing that we highlight is that we have to remember we're part of a global automotive industry. It sounds a little high and mighty, but we really are part of a global automotive industry. And we see the Chinese moving very, very quickly into BEVs. We see the Europeans, whether they want to or not, are moving quickly into BEV. Someone once said, why don't we just, continue with ICE and just forget about all this BEV? And while it sounds on a face of it, sure, there's plenty of oil. Why don't we just do that for another 20 or 30 years? I think that as our place in the global automotive industry, we would slip very, very quickly, number one. Number two, we are only 15% of the global vehicle market. I think that's something else. Everybody thinks that North America, basically drives the horse or drives the truck. It doesn't. China's a third. Europe's close to 18, 20%. And then we're about 15%. So for good or for bad, we really kind of need to follow the rest of the world from a technology perspective. Doesn't mean we need to follow them in lockstep, but we can't fall too far behind.
Well, and this came up today. Jim Farley did a fireside chat at a Morgan Stanley conference today, and he was asked, sort of what rival are you most concerned about or do you most admire? And he said China's BYD, which is going to surpass Tesla this year in global EV production. And he said 70% of global EV production comes out of China. China is the powerhouse, he said, in the electric vehicle future. And that's who we're all chasing, not Tesla. He said, my main rival is China, not GM, not Toyota.
To your point, BYD is exporting and will continue to export. If they're smart, and they're going to move production to the regions that they're selling. I think that's one thing about BEVs that a lot of people don't realize is that these vehicles are not going to be as exportable as our previous ICE versions of vehicles. So for instance, the Europeans are already very aware of that. The Mercedes, the BMWs, the Volkswagens, even the Jaguars know that the days of exporting a good amount of their production over to China, over to North America and other regions, those days, that volume is going to decline significantly in the BEV world. Why? Because it makes more sense to build those vehicles locally because of logistics and also now because of regulatory and trade legislation.
To your point there, BYD announced it's looking in Europe to put in an assembly plant. And this year, China has surpassed Japan as the number one car exporter in the world. And China's just getting going. I mean, they've got so much overcapacity there and way too many car companies making way too many different models. Their only solution for any hope at all of surviving is export. So I think they'll do like 4 million vehicles this year. Or maybe it was last year they did 4 million. But we're going to see a lot of Chinese cars get exported. I think there's a growing backlash in Europe. And that's why BYD has decided, hey, we better put an assembly plant in there.
Yeah.
And not in Eastern Europe. We need to go to Western Europe so that the supervisory boards with, half the labor content of board members doesn't come breathing down our neck and, try to keep us out of the market entirely.
Well, and Farley talked about how they've let BYD into Europe, which I found ironic because Ford is reportedly talking to BYD about selling them their Saarlouis plant in Germany. So who's letting BYD in exactly?
Yeah, that's right.
Michael, going back to your study, one of the points you made is, and this goes to something you just said a moment ago, that it's no longer a globally based industry and that there's more localism going on. Explain what that means and what the implications are for both suppliers and OEMs.
Well, I'm actually going to use an example. So the recent IRA agreement, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, it doesn't really describe what it really meant to the automotive industry, but it really changed the way that the OEMs look at the industry in North America, where they point their value add, looking at upstream, where do they refine their materials and the like. I would say, and again, I'm going back almost 60 years. The U.S.-Canada Auto Pact of 1965 was probably the most important automotive trade legislation to hit this continent ever. And I think the IRA is as impactful, if not more. Why? Because it basically says if you want the rebate to apply to your vehicle, you had better make the battery locally. And if you also want an additional rebate, you better find a way to get the inputs made locally, or at least refined locally from a value add perspective. That is a major shift. I mean, we've had years where we would bring in engines from China and Europe and put them into vehicles in North America and think nothing of it. But those days are really kind of winding down, and we're going from a globally developed vehicle, but a locally sourced and built vehicle, which is a major difference.
Yeah. Hey, you guys, we got to take a quick commercial break. We'll be back in 30 seconds. A lot more to talk about here.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on wet roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
The world is changing at an ever-increasing pace. No matter what the mode of transportation, there is always the need for an efficient propulsion system. And that's exactly what BorgWarner has been doing since the earliest days of the automotive industry.
All right. Thank you, Bridgestone and BorgWarner, for that support. So back. Keith, let's go back to that capital markets presentation that Ford had today. It went on for hours. I was scribbling notes like crazy. I think I learned a lot, but I'm curious what your takeaway was.
Yeah, it really didn't move the stock, unfortunately. They were trying to convince a skeptical Wall Street that they can get to an 8% EBIT margin on their EV business by the end of 2026 from the $3 billion in losses they're predicting this year on that basis. And just reading the analyst reports, it didn't seem like they closed the deal on that quite yet. They've got a lot in front of them in terms of cost cutting. And the analysts are in this kind of show me state of mind because Ford's had very up and down financial results in the last couple of years.
They lost billions last year.
Right. They had big misses. This most recent quarter, they did well, but the two previous quarters were big misses. So, the honeymoon is well over for Jim Farley, and they really need to show that they can do this thing that right now sounds like a stretch to investors, which is why their stock is languishing this year around $11. It's pretty much unchanged for the year.
Yeah, Michael, what are your thoughts of the whole capital markets day?
Well, I obviously they laid out their game plan from especially with respect to the software and how they address the markets. That is interesting. The note about the fact that we're not going to be everything to everybody. I think that that's been obvious for a little while. Obviously, there's really no sedans left in the portfolio, and like most OEMs, they're trying to find segments of the market that are high volume, that they are able to gain appropriate economy of scale and be competitive. Be honest, not only Ford, but virtually every other manufacturer, as we look at this sort of BEV to ICE transition, ICE to BEV transition, that's oxymoron, but as we go to ICE to BEV, these OEMs are going to also be challenged not only to pick the right BEV suppliers or BEV content suppliers, but also, as we were saying earlier, keeping their ICE suppliers, keeping them afloat, keeping them active and viable. That is going to be a real trick over the next 6 to 7 years for sure.
Right.
So I got a question. I got a question for Michael and John. Okay. So Keith mentioned that there was the $3 billion loss on Model E, the electric and software part of the business last year, and that in 26 they want to go from 40.6% down to 8% up. Okay. So we're talking about in 4 years. From a manufacturing standpoint, can any company make that big a shift, and how can they possibly do it?
Yeah, I think they can. What Ford has also said is by the end of this year, Keith, you chime in on this. I think that with the Mach-E, they say they're going to be almost break even from a contribution margin standpoint.
That's
contribution margin meaning, all the raw materials and the labor and everything that goes into making a car. So
okay, almost break even is not breaking even. Go ahead.
I know, but Gary, as you know, scale.
But
Scale
even that
changes everything.
Even that almost break-even target is getting a lot of skepticism. Emmanuel Rosner at Credit Suisse, I think it is, feels like they need to cut the costs of their EVs in half to just get to that bogey, and never mind the 8% by the end of 2026. So
I think I would agree. I think a lot though is being placed on the shoulders of services. We're going to have over-the-air updates. We're going to be able to sell content. We've heard of OEMs that will sell a low-trim vehicle and through over-the-air updates and other augmentations, be able to give them a mid-trimmed vehicle while it sits in the driveway. So that whole services idea, and again, it's still a lot of it has to be proven out, but we've seen GM, Ford, and virtually every other OEM want to go down that road because they want that sort of reoccurring value and revenue stream going forward, and I'm sure they're counting on that as well.
And it's less cyclical.
And they're not the only ones. And look, Wall Street's got good reason to be skeptical, especially with Ford. They got to execute. They got to show them that they're doing it. But Mary Barra is saying the same thing at GM. They're talking about similar EBIT margins on their EVs in a similar time frame. And she cites two other things that, besides making the EVs taking cost out, Farley mentioned they've taken $5,000 cost out of the Mach-E since it's been launched. So they're making progress in that regard. But, Mary has talked about selling subscription services and things like that on the EVs, and the government money. You can't ignore that. I mean, there's a whole bunch of government money for building EVs. And that's how, I can't remember if she said 6% or 8%. Maybe she said, mid-single digit. But in any case, Ford's not the only one saying this. GM is too.
Farley made a good point today on another way of looking at EV costs. Obviously, the battery is the biggest cost. And he said, we are large battery obsessed in this industry because everyone is trying to deal with the range anxiety question. And he says that really isn't the right answer. We should be looking for smaller battery solutions. He said humans are just naturally inclined to stop after 200 miles and refuel. So why do we need a battery that weighs a ton to go to a 500-mile range? That's a pointless and expensive exercise. And he says we need to rethink the whole battery equation.
But if that's what the customers want, then isn't he flying in the face of his customer?
I think what he's trying to say is it's kind of an irrational fear, and that we need to sort of, if you will, re-educate the marketplace that you should buy just enough battery for what you need. You don't need to overbuy because these things are really expensive.
I mean, we see more of that in Europe, to be honest with you, Keith, where the European OEMs, remember the European OEMs, you pay to register your vehicle based on the weight of the vehicle. I mean, yeah, there's a footprint issue, but basically on the weight of the vehicle. So a 9,000-pound Hummer is not going to fly real well in Europe because the registration cost is going to be very, very, very high. So, they're trying to reduce the size of their batteries as well, and make them, a little bit more appropriate to the range that the customer maybe expects out of that vehicle.
Yeah, but go back to what Doug Field said too. He's promising 300 miles of range at 70 miles an hour. So this is not a combination city highway. I think city highway, they're talking 350 miles range with a battery 1/3 the size of what they've got right now. So he's not just trying to talk customers into buying a smaller battery and accepting lower range. Based on what I heard them say, they're driving for far greater efficiency in the EVs that they're coming out with that will allow them to use a smaller battery and take out costs that way.
It speaks to them wanting to go all in on the LFP battery chemistry because That's a lighter battery that charges more quickly. And so, the deal they have with CATL for that plant in Marshall could be a view of the future.
Hey, Michael, we got a quick question from the chat room here from Michael Rhodes. Wants to know, how many EVs is GM going to build in Mexico this year?
Not many. I'd have to check my numbers. I know that they're launching, I think, next year. If I'm not mistaken, now someone's going to correct me on that. But they are launching at Ramos Arizpe. I don't think it's the end of this year. I think it's into next year that launches.
That's the Blazer, right? That's going to be made in Mexico.
If I remember correctly, that's correct.
And I think the Equinox too, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to your earlier question, John. Not to kind of circumvent it, but there's just greater economies of scale as we move to BEV. If we only have 1 or 2 battery chemistries, we have maybe 4 to 5 different e-motors among all different vehicles that are being built, whether it's GM or Ford or whoever it would be. Count the number of engine families we have right now. Count the number of transmission families we have right now. If you can reduce that and change them on the fly with over-the-air updates, it's a whole nother world from an economies of scale perspective.
Yeah. Just to get back to Michael Rhodes a minute, I think the answer is not many this year. Next year, it's going to be a whole lot more that GM will build in Mexico. And don't forget, the Mach-E is made in Mexico.
Yeah,
too.
Ford is building plenty of electric vehicles in Mexico, and they just doubled capacity at that plant. So 6 figures of Mach-E production out of Mexico.
But to your point, launches I think are going to be different though in the BEV world. We have a number of OEMs. It's kind of like the Wild West. Everybody's doing it a little bit differently. I make my battery a bit differently. My battery box is different. I'm using a different e-motor. We spent 100 years figuring out how to make the internal combustion engine, and for the most part, it's not all the same, but there aren't a lot of variances in terms of how we build engines. But in the BEV world, it astonishes us how every OEM is trying to do it a little different because they might have a better idea. But I will say economies of scale is going to improve very, very quickly in the battery space. I had a buddy of mine from one of the D3 came over, and we're between a couple of beers. He said, if we are low versus our competitor by $10 a kilowatt hour, on a 100 kilowatt battery, that is a major disadvantage. That kind of disadvantage does not exist in the ICE world right now, but it definitely could exist in the battery world. So this is why it's so important to gain economies of scale.
So one of the quotes that I thought was interesting that Kumar Galhotra said, who's in charge of Ford Blue, and I want you guys to unpack this for me. During the presentation, he said, quote, "We are less exposed than our competition during this EV transition. More than 70% of Rangers sold are sold in places with minimal EV infrastructure." So what did he mean about the less exposure, and why did he point out that there are a whole bunch of Rangers being sold where they can't be recharging batteries?
I think he's saying we're a more ICE dependent company than others. I'm not sure that's actually a virtue, but it is if you run Ford Blue. And, the Ranger is a global vehicle. The U.S. is not its largest market. So, places like Thailand, where they sell a hell of a lot of Rangers, I don't think they necessarily have a great charging infrastructure.
Look, this has been Toyota's argument, right? That, hey, when you look at the developed world, they're not ready for the EV transition. It's going to be a long time coming there. And that's why Toyota's been arguing, in favor of hybrids and PHEVs instead of just pure ICE.
Absolutely. And I think the other factor is everybody talks about infrastructure, but there's sort of 3 arguments there. One is, are we going to have enough charging stations or charging ports? Number 1. Number 2, are we going to have enough power? And number 3, is the power going to the right places? And those are 3 different questions. If you talk to your average utility, they will say, yeah, we've got enough power. We got some peak demand issues, but we'll figure that out. The bigger issue, to be honest with you, is the distribution, how we distributed the right power to the right places. And those are questions that don't get answered in a year. In talking to some of the utilities, those are 5, 6, 7-year initiatives to move power and substations to the right location. So there's a lot of questions still unanswered in this whole process.
And Gary, getting back to the point that you raised there, I think this shows a fascinating bifurcation in the strategy of the different OEMs going after EVs. So GM has said, hey, Ultium, everything's going on Ultium. and it's going to fit our entire different product, our entire lineup. We'll just put different top hats on different wheelbases and tracks, and boom, boom, we're there. Volkswagen, the same way, doing all kinds of different models. Hyundai Group doing all different kinds of models. What Ford has said is, we're not going to do that. We are going to target specific segments of the market, and we're going to optimize those vehicles for those duty cycles. So, we're going to have a Mach-E that is, performance oriented. We're going to have a Lightning that's just going to be a pickup truck. We're going to have an E-Transit that is just going to be for commercial vehicles. And so maybe that's what Kumar is getting at, that we're less exposed because we, the Ford Motor Company, speaking on behalf of him, we're just going into targeted segments. We're not going to try to cover the market.
See, I was wondering if basically one of the things he's saying is that, we're doing great with Bronco. Let's not, fool around. We're doing fantastic with Bronco. We're still dominant in trucks. And oh, by the way, we have this car, and you mentioned it earlier, Keith. We've got this car called a Mustang, not with an E on the end, but a Mustang. And people really love these cars. And we are not going to abandon that for the foreseeable future.
And we actually make money on these cars, which we need to do if we want to make the other ones.
Yeah.
It's very important. No, John, I think your point's very important. So I want to come back to it a little bit. So Ford is saying we want to pick our hits. And in fact, they now seem to sort of apologize that they're in the two-row crossover EV segment with the Mach-E, because Farley feels like that's the commodity segment. There's going to be 100 players, and you won't be able to get price or margin in that segment. So that's why they've cut the price of the Mach-E twice this year to match what Elon's doing with Tesla. So they want to be in segments like full-size pickup, where yes, new players are coming in, but you'll never get 100 of them. It's doubtful you'll see a Hyundai full-size pickup truck, So they want to be in a segment like that. And the other thing that they talked about, and I actually think this is in a way sort of a missed opportunity on Capital Markets Day, is they're going to do this 3-row crossover SUV. And they feel like that is also a market segment that won't be as overrun. GM did a brilliant PR move by announcing their electric Escalade the morning of Capital Markets Day, which is, of course, a 3-row SUV. But so that Duckfield showed a little schematic of the vehicle behind them. But, and I know they're trying to keep secrets and so forth, but to me, it was a missed opportunity. I feel like they could have convinced more people, even if it's just a design buck, if they would have rolled something out on stage and showed it to people. You have to think outside the traditional box of how you introduce cars and when you introduce them. What would Steve Jobs have done? What would Elon Musk have done? They would have rolled something onto the stage. They would have shown something more than a PowerPoint presentation. And I feel like that was a missed opportunity for Ford.
Wow, good point.
Keith, to your point though, you talk about 2-row and 3-row, and we've done some analysis. What's interesting is as we go to battery electric, you could almost go down half a segment in terms of size. So we traditionally in the industry have thought about C's and CDs and D's and E's. You can almost go down a half segment and have as much, if not more, interior space in your BEV than you had in your ICE. And that is not lost on a lot of OEMs. They also understand that making the vehicle bigger doesn't exactly reduce range a significant amount like it does in the ICE world, because you're able to recapture a lot of that energy with regen and a lot of other factors. So the dynamics are much different now in terms of how they segment and white space that they look for in the future.
Right, those are great points, and Farley seemed to be like teasing that a little bit. He was talking about how the 3rd row of their crossover will be larger than any 3rd row you've ever seen. So I just think they have all this new interior space they can play with. It doesn't all have to be thrown into a frunk. There's other ways to use that open space, and we're going to see those executions.
Keith, you're right, but the little schematic you talked about of them showing that 3-row SUV, the schematic that had a person sitting in that 3rd row looked like their knees was in their chin.
It looked tiny.
It didn't look very roomy to me. I mean, maybe they should have cheated on their schematic.
Again, missed opportunity, John. They should have given us something that was a little more dazzle than what we saw.
Yeah.
All right, so here's another quote. This is from John Lawler, the CFO of Ford, who said, quote, "Disruptive technology allows us to leverage foundational strengths to build new capabilities, enriching customer experiences and deepening loyalty." Could any of you guys tell me what disruptive technology Ford has?
Well, I think to be, I think to be fair, I mean, anything that's new to, new to the market in terms of how it's executed, whether it be, like I was saying earlier, over-the-air updates or, some of the new drive technologies and how batteries are charged and how they, wireless versus non-wireless, all these other factors, you can almost put those into a disruptive category bucket because it is all new to the customer. This is
Right,
everything's
Ford,
basically new.
Ford is not first in any of those.
No, I wouldn't. I don't know. I'm sure there's a couple that I'm sure that they've patented and they're going to be first in. But it's all disruptive technology to most of the, especially the mass market buyers. I think we can't lose sight of the fact that your average buyer has not sometimes even ridden in a BEV yet. That day's coming, and they're going to be looking at it as a consideration vehicle over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years as more product is available to them in their price category.
See, I think he's talking about something else. Because when you get into battery chemistries or motor windings or asynchronous or permanent, the public doesn't know any of that stuff. They don't even care. It's too confusing. I think he's talking about digital services in the car. And, they're all taking their cue from China right now. China is in the lead by a wide margin in providing that in mass market cars. And that's my readout of it, of what Doug Field is talking about, is providing people in the car with a wow factor that separates their brand from others.
I mean, there could be more to come, Gary, but what we know about right now is just them refining something that's already out there. So they've gotten sort of good reviews on Blue Cruise. They are not first by any stretch with that technology, but they feel like they have some sort of competitive advantage. And with LFP batteries, Farley today was talking about, getting, 200 miles of range in a 10-minute charge. Well, that would be a game changer. So, but they're not the first with LFP batteries. Tesla has them. So no, they're not the first, but they are taking other people's disruptive technologies and I guess trying to make them more mainstream.
See, what I'm thinking here is that this is I think a curse of Detroit, where Detroit thinks that it's always been first, it's always been best, it's always been biggest. And Keith, as you pointed out earlier, Wall Street didn't exactly say, hey, these guys really had it. And so Adam Jonas of Morgan Stanley wrote, "We suspect the ultimate manifestation of Ford's transformation may follow a materially different path than that conveyed in Dearborn on Monday." So basically he's saying, these guys are really talking a lot of smack here, and we think that maybe something else is going to be happening. And I think that, so they're talking about quality. And, we mentioned earlier the issue of supplier relationships. I mean, Ford is not at the bottom of the list. Ford is second from the bottom of the list in terms of supplier relationships. And it had the biggest decline of any company. And it's been declining since 2014. And I'm thinking, quality is one of the ways that they're going to succeed in this business. Well, not if you don't have the suppliers on your side.
Well, currently their supply chief is their CFO, John Lawler. He has the job on an interim basis because Hao Tai-Tang left kind of abruptly. And Hao was the one who was handling that previously. And by the way, that was also adjunct to his day job as head of product development. So they haven't really had a dedicated supply chief, purchasing chief, whatever you want to call it, in a long time. And, I think the suppliers notice that.
Yeah, I would say quality is absolutely going to be critical. I talked about earlier some of these lumpy launches. We're building brand new vehicles, and sometimes brand new or at least completely outfitted plants or brand new refurbished plants, new build processes, sometimes a lot of new suppliers that are coming in. We've had the skill, the folks that are building the vehicles differently, a lot of new. And new means to us that there could basically be some pretty slow launches, and quality is going to absolutely be so critical I remember the days, and John, Gary, even Keith, you guys remember the days when Bob Eaton went on the stage and dropped a bag of parts on the stage and basically said, these are the carryover parts from the last Grand Cherokee, and everybody's applauding, and a lot of us are going, wow, you basically are building a brand new vehicle. I hope you know what you're doing. And of course, those launches can get lumpy, and we believe that the launches are going to be a bit delayed, and the launch curves are going to be have a much lower slope. Not all of them, but I think that definitely there's going to be some good examples out there.
Michael, I studied under Jim Harbour, and he always said, an all new product in an all new plant with an all new workforce is a recipe for disaster.
We have a lot of disasters coming.
So given that, okay, so how does the consumer react to that, right? Because I mean, ultimately, if it's a bad product, the consumer is the one who's going to be the one who's suffering. I mean, doesn't this perhaps push back on their willingness or excitement about buying a new EV, whether it's from Ford or anybody else?
I think, Gary, this comes back to that, who is the next level of buyer? Because the early adopters clearly did not push back on the awful quality of the early Teslas with their huge gaps between their panels and door handles that didn't function and all sorts of things that, just cars shutting down, screens turning off. All those Tesla loyalists, look how they are online. My goodness, they forgive every cent. But will the next wave of buyers who are buying from, legacy automakers, will they put up with that? I mean, it takes them back to 70s style quality. I'm not sure they will.
That's right. But, you can have bad quality in the plant and still deliver the customer a good car. But it takes a lot of inspection and rework, which means you're losing all your profit along the way. So that's going to be the dilemma. How do they deal with this all new product, all new plant, all new workforce, and still deliver the customer a decent car? And look, this is why everyone's struggling. Rivian's way behind. Lucid is way behind. Elon went through his production hell. General Motors is going through production. They're all doing it. But what they're doing their damnness to do is at least deliver a good car to the customer. But like I said, they're eating it with the cost of bad quality.
They've also got the advantage of most of them anyways going forward with over-the-air updates. So whereas the day of, well, you need to get back to your dealer, we're going to reflash this ECU or whatever the case might be, they're able to do that a little bit more quickly, certainly with over-the-air updates. I'm not saying it's some sort of panacea and it cures all, because a hardware issue is a hardware issue. Right. But nonetheless, they do have that in their back pocket going forward, and I think a lot of OEMs are counting on that.
Yeah, when they have OTAs for paddle gaps, this industry will rock.
One thing, though, we should not forget is, just a few months ago, we had a Ford Lightning in the holding lot outside the plant erupt in flames because of a battery problem. This industry is still figuring out battery fires. That has not been solved. So if that gets to a customer's hands, which it did on some Teslas, as we know, that's a problem. That's really a problem for EV adoption.
And bolts.
Sorry, I didn't mean to leave anybody out.
Well, to the point of over-the-air updates fixing things, and so I was looking at the NHTSA recalls, and now, admittedly, this is a small number, 764 vehicles, but let me read what it says. Ford is recalling certain 2020 to 2022 Explorer vehicles. The previous powertrain control module update completed under recall 22, blah, 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 did not include the automatic electronic parking brake feature when the vehicle is shifted to park as intended. In addition, the rear axle horizontal mounting bolt may fracture and cause the drive shaft to disconnect. So here was a digital fix, which presumably somebody had to go to the dealership to get done, that didn't work. And so I don't know that over the updates, I mean, we sort of imagine that all of the information, the packets are going to be sent properly. And I mean, so before the show started, Michael, I mean, you had problems getting with your camera, right? I mean, and you'd done it a million times using the camera, but you had to switch to your phone because, software is tricky business. I mean, and we just sort of think, it won't be a problem at all. Things will go fine. But as we can see, not necessarily.
Welcome to the new reality.
Hey, look, guys, we're at the top of the hour here. Probably a good time to wrap it up. But Michael, Keith, great having the both of you guys on. Excellent insights, excellent information.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. And Gary, I'll see you next week.
Indeed. Have another good show. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey. And by Borg Warner, propulsion solutions that support a clean, energy-efficient world.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the Autoline channel.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on what roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
The world is changing at an ever-increasing pace. No matter what the mode of transportation, there is always the need for an efficient propulsion system. And that's exactly what Borg Warner has been doing since the earliest days of the automotive industry.